All right, chapter 3 of Atlas Shrugged, and that is called The Top and the Bottom. And so we're going chapter by chapter in Atlas Shrugged right now by Ayn Rand. And I'll tell you, this stuff will start to make your blood boil, unless you're a commie, in which case you might be just all right with it. So Orrin Boyle is hanging out with James Taggart up at this bar up high in some building, and they're having drinks, and they're basically talking a whole bunch of commie nonsense, like, um, everybody should basically have to suffer because they can't be productive. So Orrin Boyle's this dude who's supposed to be fulfilling the steel orders for the rails they need to fix the Rio Norte line. If you didn't see my first couple chapters, go back. And he's had a year to do it, and he didn't do it. So now Dagny Taggart's going with Reardon Metal, and because she needs somebody who's going to get this stuff done. And Orrin Boyle had a year, never produced anything. But because he's friends with James Taggart, the president of the company, they're like, still trying to work with this guy, which I think is a bit ridiculous. So what's happening here is James and Orrin, and oddly enough, Paul Larkin, who was at Hank Reardon's house, who's friends with Reardon, is sitting at the table with these guys. And they're basically just talking about how Orrin Boyle says the only justification of private property is public service. So they're already attacking your basic freedoms like private property, things like that. They basically want the world to just suit them. So Orrin Boyle says at one point, Jim, will you agree, I'm sure, you will agree, I'm sure, that there's nothing more destructive than a monopoly. Yes, said Taggart, on the one hand, but on the other, there's the blight of unbridled competition. So basically, this guy doesn't want any uncontrolled competition. He wants the game to be fixed and rigged. So it's okay if Taggart Transcontinental is a monopoly, because that would suit everybody best. They don't want people going willy-nilly and attacking each other or stealing each other's business or doing anything too bad, especially in trying times. They're really just going off on this nonsense. So I highlighted another part here, which James says, speaking of progressive policies, Orrin, said Taggart, you might ask yourself whether at a time of transportation shortages, when so many railroads are going bankrupt and large areas are left without rail service, whether it is in the public interest to tolerate wasteful duplication of services and the destructive dog-eat-dog competition of newcomers in territories where established companies have historical priority. So because he has the oldest railroad company, he doesn't want the Phoenix Durango, this other rival company who's stolen his business from Elliott Wyatt, who is a very productive guy. He's got a product coming out of, the mines or whatever in Colorado, and he needs to transport this stuff. And Taggart Transcontinental's rail line was so backed up and breaking down that he went with this competition. And so because the Orrin Boyle and James Taggart are not productive people, they're just peddling this progressive nonsense where, we should have all the time in the world to mess around and everybody should have to deal with it because that's what's best for humanity. This sort of nonsense, this corporate type of communism, though, where, they get to rig the game and they get to control what happens. So, your blood starts to boil a little bit when you're listening to this nonsense. And they're basically planning how, they can mitigate the competition. And, they start getting into the Mexican line, the San Sebastian line, which has cost them all sorts of money. And Boyle spoke up with indifferent curiosity. Say, Jim, I meant to ask you, what in the hell's the matter with your train service down on the San Sebastian line? Why, what do you mean? What is the matter with it? James says. Well, I don't know, but running just one passenger train a day is one train. So Orrin says, and where on earth did you get that wood-burning locomotive? So James is like, has no idea that they're running only one train a day. And they're running a wood burning locomotive down there because his sister is in charge of operations for the company. So basically, they just go into the fact that, Mexico's not going to seize their line and nationalize it. They're not going to lose their investment down there. And, the copper mines that D'Anconia is digging up should be good. And, that's basically what's happened at this dinner. But all of a sudden, you notice that Paul Larkin's there, right? And Wesley Mouch. And, I keep wanting to call him Welch is great, but Wesley Mouch was there. And Paul Larkin is connected with Reardon, at this point, because Paul Larkin was at Reardon's house a chapter before. And he was begging him to put on a friendly face and make nice with the people of Washington. And now you're kind of finding out why, is because Larkin's sitting at the table with them. So is Larkin with James Taggart and, all this, communism they're pushing out in Washington, where where they get to control the game, or now is Larkin with Reardon, and we don't know. So yeah, it's just gets a little crazy. So this is what Taggart says to Paul Larkin towards the end of their time together. He says, "Social reforms are slow," said James Taggart. "A difficult undertaking ahead of us, Jim," Boyle was saying, "a difficult undertaking with so many dangers and complications and so much at stake." "It all depends," James Taggart answered slowly, "on knowing the people that make it possible. That's what has to be done. Who makes it possible?" So they want to push a progressive agenda out in Washington and to basically get rid of any competition on the railroad. And, they're not too happy with Reardon because he's got the market cornered at this point, because he worked his ass off and he's a producer and he's got the mines and he's got the metal and he can make it happen. And so they're just mad because he's producing. So it's not really cool. After all that, it's kind of a longer chapter. We get into Dagny Taggart's past, how when she was 9, she knew she wanted to work and run the railroad. How when she was 16, she was working for the railroad. When she was a kid, she was unbearably bored by these, everybody. She was logical, rational, reasonable, competent. So she's pretty bored with adults and other people who just, want to have fun or, I don't know, just do nonsense. She wants to focus on building and producing and creating something. She's really into math and rationality, and she's really good at math too, problem solving. So she goes to become an engineer. And one thing she was told as a child is, "You're unbearably conceited. You're selfish." And I love this quote here. It says, "She looked at the adults, wondering how they could imagine that she would feel guilt from an undefined accusation." So she never received an answer for when she asked, "Why am I selfish? Why am I conceited?" It was just because she wanted to focus on what she wanted to focus on. She had a defined sense of purpose, and people who don't, often don't understand. So she rose quickly at Taggart Transcontinental, and it said there were a few rare men of talent around her, but they were becoming rarer every year. Her father seemed astonished and proud of her. So I think I mentioned in the first chapters, you will hear the word astonished with Dagny a lot. And astonished means to fill with sudden wonder or a great surprise. So, yeah, her father was dying, and her father seemed astonished and proud of her, but he said nothing, and there was sadness in his eyes when he looked at her in the office. She was 29 years old when he died. Astonished is always happening around her. Open astonishment is the Fool card, the beginning of the journey, having this open optimism where there's a positive dissolution of structures, not a negative dissolution, which would be the bad side of it. Positive dissolution of structures for growth. And we have sort of the tower theme that had been playing itself out. The world's kind of going to crap. They're running out all this commie stuff. Nobody really cares about production anymore. They're making excuses and blaming the productive people, the people who produce and the people who are competent, because they don't want to let them you know, oh, because they get in the way of their humanity and compassion and all this nonsense that actually leaves people hungry at the end of the day. So we learn a little bit more about Dagny, which is cool. And it says the adversary she found herself forced to fight was not worth matching or beating. It was not a superior ability, which she would have found honor and challenging. It was ineptitude. So a lack of skill or ability is what she had a battle against. And she didn't really care to fight it because she couldn't find people who were competent. So a great quote on the next page is, she felt herself screaming silently at times for a glimpse of human ability, a single glimpse of clean, hard, radiant competence. She had fits of tortured longing for a friend or an enemy with a mind better than her own. But the longing passed. She had a job to do. She did not have time to feel pain, not often. So she was longing for somebody with a mind better than her own. She wants to learn from somebody. This is, as an astrologer, this is a very Cancerian or Capricornian type trait, which they have like the sort of genius to their mind, Cancers and Capricorns. And so they often appear very serious to everybody else. But what happens is that they're actually just looking for somebody they can learn from, somebody who is competent, somebody who can teach them, or so to speak, something like that. So they often appear like they got, resting bitch face or something, but really it's just because they already know so much. They're looking for somebody who can teach them. So, we go down a little bit and we get, introduced to the fact that Francisco d'Anconia was, inherited his fortune and he's got these mines going and everything else. So that's why James invests in them. James is like, d'Anconia's never lost money. He always wins, even though he's a bum, even though he's depraved, even though he's lost morality, so to speak. He makes money. And so we're going to bet on him. He bought mines in Mexico. We can run this this line in the middle of nowhere, this railroad line, and it's supposedly going to help a bunch of people, but it really doesn't. And so Dagny was never able to discover what influences prompted James Taggart to build a railroad branch from Texas into the wilderness of San Sebastian. So the company needed all its resources to rebuild the Rio Norte line. It could not do both. So here they are screwing their American customers so they can build a line in Mexico to mines they don't even know may or may not produce copper, may or may not produce the stuff that they're looking for, but they trust Francisco d'Anconia, so because he's always made money. So there must be copper there and they're going to make money. But also, they use all these justifications. So Dagny fought against the building of the San Sebastian line, but she was only an assistant in the operating department, too young, without authority, and nobody listened. She was unable to understand the motives of those who decided to build the line. So she's like, what are we doing here, guys? Like, we got this Rio Norte line failing. We got to put our resources there. And you guys are messing around with Mexico, like with money we can't afford to spend. She was unable then or since to understand the motives of those who decided to build the line. They spoke about the future importance of the trade with Mexico, about a rich stream of freight, about the large revenues assured to the exclusive carrier of an inexhaustible supply of copper. They proved it by citing Francisco d'Anconia's past achievements. They did not mention any mineralogical facts about the San Sebastian mines. Few facts were available. The information which d'Anconia had released was not very specific, but they did not seem to need facts. So here they are, messing around, without any knowledge of what's going on down there, and they're about to dump 40 million into these lines. And she's telling them, like, we got to think about our customer base. We got to grow this railroad. We have to produce a product or else we won't be in operation. It's good to work with an engineer, right? People actually know what they're doing. She knows what she's doing. So since a man must think of the good of his brothers before he thinks of his own, it seems to me that a nation must think of its neighbors before it thinks of itself. What a crock of shit, right? Like, this is the stuff they're saying in this boardroom to justify their crap. And so Ellis Wyatt. That's the guy's name. I think I said Elliot Wyatt, but Ellis Wyatt. Yeah, that's the guy who was a newcomer who's producing all this stuff in Colorado, and he needs the trains. So there they are, not putting their own mask on so that they can breathe before they assist, a whole other nation. But they're shooting themselves in the foot to do it for the good of humanity. But they're just messing around, and they figured, hey, we're going to make money because Danconia never loses, so we don't actually have to do anything productive. What happens is these people screw around for 3 years, and then finally they get Dagny out there, and it was she who finally gave them their San Sebastian line. When she took over, the construction had been underway for 3 years. 1/3 of its track was laid. The cost to date was beyond the authorized total. She fired Jim's friend and found a contractor who completed the job in 1 year. The Rio Norte line, which she needs to rebuild, she calls Reardon. She goes, Hank, can you save us? Can you give us rail on the shortest notice and the longest credit possible? A quiet, steady voice had answered, sure. So already we like Reardon. He's not messing around. It's like, you need the rails? You need to save your line? I got you. Reardon metal is the way to go. So you're starting to get a more complete picture by chapter 3 of a little bit what's going on here. So then she gets back into it with her brother. And they're talking about how they're going to nationalize the Mexican line. And if they nationalize it, they lose everything. So just so you know, up to this point, we found out that both Danconia, who owns the mines, and Taggart Transcontinental owns the railroad, signed 200-year contracts with Mexico that they can't nationalize for 200 years. But that's not going to stop them. And so, they're thinking they might nationalize this stuff. So her brother's arguing with her about it. And he's getting upset with her because he figured out they're using one wood-fired train, And she says, if you want to know, I have left nothing but junk on the San Sebastian line, and as little of that as possible. I have moved everything that could be moved, switch engines, shop tools, even typewriters and mirrors, out of Mexico. And her brother's like, why in blazes? And she says, so that the looters won't have too much to loot when they nationalize the line. And he flips out and says she won't get away with that, and that they're not going to nationalize the line. It's rumors. And she said, I won't permit it. I absolutely won't. This is Taggart right now. James, sorry. James says, I won't permit it. I absolutely won't permit such an outrageous policy toward a friendly people who need our help. Material greed isn't everything. So look who's high and mighty right now. So Taggart's all high and mighty. And then towards the end, she takes a walk and we get introduced to Nat Taggart, which is her ancestor who built the railroad line. We should get a lot of cool background on that. And then she sees a guy who works at a cigarette stand, which I thought was cool. Not, I don't smoke, but, I know people who do. And here's a cool quote for those of you who are interested. This guy who works at a newsstand, used to work in like a cigarette factory, and he collects cigarettes. And she kind of goes and asks him about it. And he says, I like cigarettes, Miss Taggart. I like to think of fire held in a man's hand. Fire, a dangerous force, tamed at his fingertips. I often wonder about the hours when a man sits alone watching the smoke of a cigarette, thinking, I wonder what great things have come from such hours when a man thinks. There is a spot of fire alive in his mind, and it is proper that he should have the burning point of a cigarette as his one expression. So I thought that was a pretty romantic way of putting it. Then later on in the conversation with the same guy, Dagny is talking to him, and he shrugs and goes, oh, well, who is John Galt? Which John Galt is like the theme that's been running through. But it kind of means like, nobody knows. So, or don't ask questions, no one knows the answer to. At least that's what the engineer said in the last chapter. Dagny really doesn't like this who is John Galt bull crap, right? And she says, I don't like that empty piece of slang. What does it mean? Where did it come from? And he says, nobody knows. And he says, why does it disturb you? He asks, and she said, I don't like what they seem to mean when they say it. And this guy says, I don't either. So you get kind of into that, and they go a little bit into Eddie Willers, but it's not too big a deal. And Eddie really just kind of says how Dagny kind of stays to herself and she likes Richard Halley outside of work, and that's about it. She plays his records. All in all, it's pretty good chapter, pretty good background. We're still getting a lot of background on characters at this point. Um, so yeah, that's kind of what's going down. We'll see you next chapter.